bared its fangs and started flexing its international muscles, one man was writing on China's 100-year marathon and its secret plan to replace the United States as the world's leading superpower. This was at a time when many in the Western world of academia and think tanks were still looking at China with rose-tinted glasses and seeing in Beijing a friend and not a threat. The theme of this year's conclave is the India moment, but there is a giant dragon hanging over that Indian moment, and that dragon lives in Beijing. To discuss the biggest threat to India's growth and to the global system at large, I am delighted to welcome to the India Today conclave one of the world's leading experts on China, Mr. Michael Pillsbury. Mr. Pillsbury has been advisor to many US presidents. He's a consultant at the US Department of Defense. He's the director of Chinese strategy at the Hudson Institute, and he's known the world over for his prescient book, The 100-Year Marathon, China's Secret Strategy to Replace America as the Global Superpower. If you haven't read this, you absolutely must. Joining Mr. Pillsbury, for an Indian perspective, we have Manoj Kevalramani. Manoj is the chairperson of the Indo-Pacific Research Program and a China Studies Fellow at the Takshashila Institute, a public policy center. So welcome, and let's now talk about the biggest threat to the India moment. And can I get Mr. Pillsbury to look back at this book, which came out in 2015, a lot of what America now takes as given, you've already written about way back. You talk about China replacing the United States, the world's #1 power, by 2049. Are you still on track for that timeline? Is the timeline being advanced into the future? Has it been brought forward? Mr. Pillsbury, let's start from there.
Thank you. I think the Chinese are ahead of schedule. I underestimated how fast they would surpass America in various indicators. The Heritage Foundation actually next month is going to come out with a list of indicators where China has already surpassed America. Some of them are quite dramatic. When the Chinese launched a round the world hypersonic missile, we can't do that. We were quite certain China could not do that. When they went to the far side of the moon, we can't do that. We were surprised that China could do it. In the number of biotech areas, China has already surpassed us. So I underestimated two things. One was the progress of China. The other was, I thought a coalition would form both inside America and around the world that would slow China down, that would say you're stealing too much, you're breaking the rules, you're doing things you never said before you would do. So there'd be a coalition. And the key member of the coalition would be India. That has not happened. No real coalition is formed against China's conduct anywhere in the world. And in particular, something called the Quad was formed. Initially, the media thought this was to talk about China. Australia, Japan, India, the United States. The heads of state would meet, the foreign ministers would meet. But actually what happened in the joint statement that would come out of the Quad meetings, China could not be mentioned. One country that belongs to the Quad prevented the others from saying anything negative about China in their joint statements. So China's grown much faster than I thought, and the response from around the world has been much weaker than I thought. So if anything, the 100-year marathon is ahead of schedule, to answer your question.
So by when, in your estimate, does China overtake the United States and emerge as the world's global superpower #1? Is that inevitable? Can America still win?
You know, when you think about cricket and soccer and worldwide sports, there's a number of things that happen that billions of people watch. You know the score. It's up on the scoreboard. You can see the umpire make a good call or make a bad call. You know who the teams are. In the US-China or the India-China competition, there's none of that. There's no announcement. The score is not made public. And there's no umpire. That's the most important thing of all. There's no umpire. So the role of India today and the worldwide media in general is very important. They've got to describe what is the game that's going on, that's secret, that's behind the scenes. Which indicators should we watch? I didn't mention another surprise to me was nuclear weapons. The Chinese have told the world since their first nuclear test in 1964, we don't believe in nuclear weapons. Yes, we have a couple hundred, maybe, but that's only for defense. Now, just in the last 2 years, it's been announced by our strategic forces, China is having a breakout, what's called strategic breakout. They're building so many new ICBM silos that just 2 weeks ago, our key general said, China now has more ICBM nuclear weapons silos than America. This is a big surprise, but is there a worldwide coverage of the team players in cricket? Suddenly this has happened? No, you'll find it very difficult to find in any newspaper in the world or any TV show in the world other than yours that this is happening. Now, if the Chinese go for 1,500 nuclear warheads, which is the American military estimate, they're going for either parity or to surpass both America and Russia. Now, Indian nuclear forces it's secret, but let's say it's 100 or 200. If China goes for 1,500, that's a 7-to-1 superiority against the Indian moment that we're talking about so much today. But again, it's not covered as a cricket match or as a worldwide World Cup.
I can see Mr. Pillsbury is quite inspired by Sachin Tendulkar's session just before this. But one of your specializations really is to compare comprehensive national power. And if you were to give us your ranking, where do you see relative to the United States, China stand at this moment? Where does India stand in your global matrix? And where do you see things move from?
Well, the only places in the world that this kind of question is answered are secret places inside governments. The Russians have a unit that measures the balance of power. We have a unit that measures the balance of power, and so does India, frankly. So does China. I first got onto the idea of the book, The 100-Year Marathon, by visiting some Chinese experts who were working 20 years into the future. They were measuring what would China have to do to become the #1 power in the world. I could not find that kind of thinking in Moscow or Washington or Delhi or Tokyo. But the Chinese were thinking ahead. What exactly do we have to do to surpass all other powers? And they recruited the World Bank, of all people, to open its largest office in the world, 3,000 people in Beijing, to advise China what to do about their state-owned enterprises. And they came up with a phrase I'd never heard before called national champions. At that point, China had 0 companies on what's called the Fortune 500 list of the companies in the world that are the most capitalized. Now, recently, China has surpassed America. They went from 0 to 140 of their companies on this list. America's about 120. India is much lower. This is a joke, actually, they even had a billionaires index. Who had how many billionaires? In the beginning of this process, China had 0. Guess what? 3 years ago, China has more billionaires than America. Now, some indicators are a joke. They surpassed us in beer drinking. Okay, I can live with that. But the measurement of the balance of power, I've heard people at the conference today talk about India's #5 or India's #6. That's what the Chinese were 30 years ago. And they had a series of measures to get up to #2 and moving toward #1. But again, this is secret work done inside governments. And the Chinese, to my amazement, You would think as their progress went from number 6 to number 2, you would think they would be like a good World Soccer Cup, take credit, say we're number 1 and hope for applause. The Chinese stopped the World Bank and IMF from announcing that China's economy had surpassed America. They want to play all this down. They're very sensitive from their ancient literature. Never brag, never get a rival to rise up against you. So play dumb, play weak, which we still find them doing. Some of the scenes that showed the PLA marching, this is not what they prefer to present to the world. They like to show Chinese ballet, Chinese opera, Chinese art. There's a new policy that began in the last 10 years that Confucius is now the symbol of China. So Xi Jinping went to Confucius' hometown, signed some books, starts quoting from Confucius. This is what China wants to project. Don't worry about us. We're not going to become the number 1 power in history. We're just raising people up out of poverty in China. And as we do that by accident, we become the world's greatest power. So this is what we face.
Speaking of Confucius, Confucius says that there can't be 2 suns in the world, nor 2 emperors on the earth. Where do you think China sees India at this moment?
Actually, I know quite a bit about that because I used to raise the question of India with the Chinese. A lot of Americans thought over the last 50 or 60 years, there would be kind of a horse race with China and India, the 2 horses. And everybody thought India will surpass China. Democracy, speaks English, rule of law, the Communist Party quite weak. So there was no contest. But then it turned out the opposite. China pulled way ahead of India in almost every indicator. So why did this happen? It looks like the American decision to invest heavily in China and to sell or give all American scientific discoveries to China, which we do by an agreement. Same thing with technology. We, the United States government, favored China over India for the last 40 years. And you'll find this discussed both in Dr. Jaishankar's book, The India Way, and the former Foreign Secretary Saran's book, How India Sees the World. The Indian government knew this. They knew that America was blocking the transfer to India of high technology since 1974 for various reasons. So even though we thought the Indian horse would win the race, in fact, what happened is we helped the Chinese horse, which ultimately ends up 4 or 5 times larger and more technologically advanced than India. Now, this has begun to change, but it's still not totally changed. Our trade with India still is not as high as with China. We're increasing our investment in China. Even after all the Xi Jinping aggressive moves, American investment in China is increasing. So the India moment is important, but there's also a China moment coming, which I believe they want to keep secret and play down. That they're so powerful now, they don't want a coalition formed against them.
Manoj, Michael Pillsbury's suggestion is that instead of waiting till 2049, China could emerge as the world's #1 superpower much before that, in the early 30s, which isn't too many years away from, this is what, 10 years away from now. He also thinks that China will inevitably win the battle to be the world's #1 superpower. Do you share that assessment? Or are you more skeptical?
Yeah, I think you can color me skeptical on that. Look, the best laid plans often end up facing reality. And I think China is in its early days of trying to emerge as a global power. You can compare different metrics of China's relationship and its comparative strength with regard to the United States. And it's quite strange, me as an Indian, saying that there is a stark disparity even today between the national comprehensive national power between China and the United States. If you just look at military power projection, Beijing's ability to project power beyond its near seas is extremely limited. In the Indian Ocean, it's extremely limited. Its ability to negotiate deals between countries is extremely limited. And I say that keeping in mind the fact that we've just seen some sort of an agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which China swooped in at the last minute to try and broker. But is that really a peace deal? No, it's an agreement to talk, as opposed to necessarily trying to start a new era in the Middle East.
Well, it's more than what the United States has been able to do. And
Indeed.
speaking of military power, if you read Michael Pillsbury's book, he writes about the assassin's mace. The assassin's mace is essentially the use of asymmetric weaponry to take on the enemy. You're not fighting conventional weapon systems with conventional weapon systems. Michael talks about the assassin's mace, and they've got more than an adequate mace to be a very deadly assassin.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm not, by no means am I trying to say that China does not have significant comprehensive national power. But I think if you're still going to compare China with the United States, there's significant daylight between them. Has that gap shrunk over the last 30 years? Obviously it has. And that is a matter of concern. I also sort of disagree with the fact that Beijing is trying to downplay its intentions. In fact, it's quite obvious that it's actually talking quite much more publicly about its intentions. If you listen to what Xi Jinping is saying, he's no longer downplaying what he believes he wants the world order to be like. If you look at what their projections for their own desires in terms of the global governance architecture that they want, his initiative on global development, Belt and Road, Global Security Initiative, and now the Global Civilization Initiative, all of those talk about a world that he wants to create. So I don't think he's downplaying that. I think he's learned lessons from the Made in China 2025 fiasco, which led to the response in the United States and the Trump administration on trade, because that sort of really crystallized the nature of the economic threat that China presented. But I don't think he's downplaying it. I think he's being quite clear about what he wants to do. But I don't think he today has the capability to achieve those goals of dominance. And I think there's some of that we need to measure some of that, and it needs to be a little bit more measured in our understanding of what China maybe desires to do and what it can do. I'd love to have $1 billion in my account. It's not there. So I think we need to keep that gap between intent and capability in mind, and that allows us to then respond in kind to try and shape the kind of behavior that we want from China.
You know, for those of you who haven't followed Michael Pillsbury's work, I just want to take you through the 9 key principles he lays out from the Warring States era, which lie at the heart of his work and which give you a sense of how he thinks China operates, and as a fact it does. So the first is induce complacency to avoid alerting your opponent. For many years, Beijing did that. Manipulate your opponent's advisors. Be patient for decades to achieve victory. Steal your opponent's ideas and technology for strategic purposes. Military might is not critical for winning a long-term war. Recognize that the hegemon, in this case the United States, will take extreme steps, even reckless action, to retain its dominant position. Deceive others into doing your bidding, and this is something China is a master at. Wait for the maximum opportunity to strike. Be vigilant to avoid being encircled or deceived by others. And one of the mistakes in Chinese history that the Warring States made is that the challenger oftentimes struck before its time had come, made the incumbent alert, and then helping the incumbent quash the challenger before the challenger could become the new superpower. Is modern day China repeating that mistake, or do you think they've learned from the mistakes of the last several centuries?
The correct answer is both. There is a debate in China that we can see indications of, that some people think Xi Jinping has gone too far, that he's a bit too open about China's goals. But I think overall, the Chinese, I know, are very sensitive to observe in the great powers of the world, how strong is the China threat theory growing? They try to measure it. They know individuals. We know that their embassies keep track of who are China's friends, who believes in the China threat theory, Who are the swing voters in between?
Are you a friend, enemy, or a frenemy?
Well, the Chinese say you used to be our friend when you delivered the Mark 46 torpedoes for our submarines in 1985, when you provided nuclear targeting data to China against the Soviet forces. President Reagan did the most to actually arm China, sell them weapon systems. So they want that Pillsbury to come back. They haven't given up hope. And there is a group in our country, the so-called G2 people. They believe the US and China have a destiny to work together against all the other powers of the world.
These are who you call panda huggers.
They just like the word G2. No G20, no G15, G2. That basically the two great economies of the world can have the world order be their work. China encourages that way of thinking. One time they proposed to Obama, they proposed again to Trump, something called the new model of great power relations. And at first it sounded very good. The new model means the rising power doesn't get attacked or hurt by the hegemon. But the Obama team started asking, well, who is in the great power relationship? Is India included? They said, no, India is not part of the great powers. And as the Obama team learned more, they turned down the Chinese offer. They've made it again to the Biden team. So this is something to watch in terms of how the world perceives the rise of China. If it's still a friendly panda, then a coalition's not necessary. And the only Cold War will be over technology issues.
If you're sitting in India, I promise you, you're not seeing a friendly panda, you're seeing a lurking dragon.
You're on the front line with China. You know, we don't have a border with China.
Given all your expertise built over the decades with China, what's your best estimate, Mr. Pillsbury? When and will the People's Liberation Army attack Taiwan?
Well, it depends on Taiwan and America's way of talking about Taiwan. The deal that was made by Henry Kissinger in the beginning was we Americans and the rest of the world pretty much included, we will not take a position on who Taiwan belongs to. We acknowledge you Chinese think that Taiwan is yours, but we don't actually accept that. So if that changes, that's a cause of war for China to attack. Right now, the ambiguity about who owns Taiwan is what keeps Beijing from having to attack. But there are already voices around the world that say Taiwan is independent. So far, America is the only country that sells weapons to Taiwan. We don't have any troops there. We don't store ammunition. We don't have a formal treaty. The Chinese belief is if we change any of that, that's a cause of war. President Trump secretly put a few American Special Forces units, they're supposed to be secret, on Taiwan. That when the Biden team came in, this somehow leaked to the press, to the Wall Street Journal, as a matter of fact. And now there's discussion of increasing the number of American advisors on Taiwan, and possibly even having military exercises with the Taiwan forces.
I didn't really get a clear answer. Ceteris paribus, things being the way they are, in your best estimate, will the People's Liberation Army attack Taiwan? And if so, when?
If I knew, I wouldn't tell you.
Manoj, let me try and get your sense of this. Do you think Xi, in the manner in which he's speaking about his armed forces, the modernization, the world's fastest modernization that's ever been seen, is it inevitable, or are they just building a muscle at this moment which won't actually need to be exercised?
I think one of the strategies that you've described also in your book is the idea that you win without fighting. So, I mean, I'm sure push comes to shove, if there is an opportunity and if the stars align and if the United States' response is predictable in a certain way, perhaps. But I don't think this is something, I mean, I followed the discourse in the United States where you have dates from 2017, 2024, 2025. I don't think this is inevitable at any point of time, and I don't think it's likely in the short term at all. It would be incredibly foolhardy, particularly after the lessons that Xi Jinping is watching Russia learn in Ukraine. So I don't see that as an imminent threat, even from an Indian point of view, as to what's going to happen in Taiwan.
You know, we have many distinguished people in our audience here at the India Today conclave, including the former chief of the Indian Army Staff, General Naravne. General Naravne, can I get you to intervene on whether you think that Michael Pillsbury is right when he thinks China is winning, that the United States will no longer post the mid-30s be the world's #1 power? And where do you, as the man who's guarded India for so long, think India stands relative to the dragon across the Himalayas? It's working, sir.
I would like to put a question to Mr. Pillsbury. You have made a very compelling case with respect to China and where they stand vis-a-vis the US. And in that context, do you think that the US is unnecessarily getting embroiled in Europe and Ukraine, and in the bargain only playing into the hands of China?
Yes, I do. I think our focus should be the Indo-Pacific. It should not be Europe. There are too many warnings being given to both India and America that we can't just ignore what's happening. I myself think it was a mistake that our country aided China so much for 40 years and neglected India, or even worse, was even anti-India. That is slowly beginning to change. And I think cooperation between the United States and India is something that China fears will derail their 100-year marathon. They're very concerned about the Japan-India bilateral relationship, that this is beginning to involve security issues, military exercises. So China is not overly confident that they're going to win the 100-year marathon. And if Indian-American cooperation can grow over the next 10 years, if our support for Indian science, Indian technology, the Indian space program, frankly, getting India involved in arms control negotiations with China, right now China has no cap on their forces. And if they're going to break the Russian-American 1,500 nuclear warheads limit, it affects India too. So the possibility of slowing China's winning the 100-year marathon or making it never happen, if our growth and India's growth is above China's, they will never win the 100-year marathon. So in a way, it's in our hands. Even though you and I are out of power right now, it's in our hands to slow down or even stop the 100-year marathon. But whether this will happen or not depends a lot on the cricket analogy. Can people tell that there's a game going on, that the umpire is calling things in the wrong way, and the score is looking bad? So far, nobody pays much attention to the global balance of power involving China,
for a man who
India, and
comes from a
America.
country obsessed with baseball, you picked up some cricketing metaphors very quickly. Nicely done. You're going to be meeting India's foreign affairs minister tomorrow, from what I gather. If you were advising the Indian government at this moment, given what you've seen of how China operates, what do you think New Delhi needs to do between now and the next 10 years to increase its national comprehensive power to be a more robust competitor to Beijing?
Well, first of all, Americans never should give advice to Indian cabinet ministers, but there is something we can learn from China. The Chinese communists had been in a war with America. There's various estimates, up to 1 million people killed on the Chinese side and the North Korean side, 20 years of hostility. But when the Chinese decided about the 100-year marathon, which is roughly 1978, 1979, they were ruthless for the next 30 years in bringing foreign investment into China. They hated the foreigners before this. But now when the Communist Party gave orders, if you and I wanted to build a cell phone factory in China, they would bring the infrastructure to us for free. Tax break, 10 years for free. All kinds of flattery. They did this across every technology sector they wanted China to grow in. It succeeded. Notice the way India treats foreign investors up until recently. Not very friendly. Mob scenes in front of McDonald's and Kentucky Fried Chicken. This is foreign stuff. You know, it shouldn't be here. The Chinese very quickly opened 1,000 Kentucky Fried Chicken stores. They opened several thousand McDonald's, Starbucks all over China. It's a miracle that the Chinese Communist Party was able to turn on a dime. Okay, the foreigners were all bad and evil before. Now we welcome foreign investment in the extreme. That worked beautifully for them. I'd love to see that happen in India as well.
Okay, so we're out of time. I could go on and on because that's how fascinating and devious everything to do with Beijing is at the same time. And very few people are as clear-eyed about China as Michael Pillsbury is. Manoj Kewalramani, thank you very much for joining us. Thanks also, Mr. Pillsbury. You'll be around, so if you have any more questions on China, feel free to walk up to Mr. Pillsbury during lunch or any of the breaks. Thank you very much. It's been an absolute honor to have you here at the conference. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please raise a warm applause for our speakers. This session was brought to you by Radico Khaitan, and I'd quickly call upon Mr. Ramar Sinha, CEO, Radico Khaitan, to come up on stage and present a small token of our appreciation to our esteemed guests. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, please raise a warm applause for our panelists. You can also buy their books, get them signed too at the Author's Corner in the atrium right outside Roshanara Hall. Thank you, Mr. Pillsbury. Thank you, Mr. Kewalramani. Thank you, Rahul.